It begins, as these stories often do, not with a disappearance but with a dream. In the spring of 2022, Madeline Carter, a 29-year-old single mother from Portland, Oregon, boarded a flight to Brazil with her 6-month-old daughter, Lily, strapped to her chest. Friends said she was restless, searching for a new identity beyond the half-finished college degree, the string of retail jobs, and the shadow of divorce that left her financially and emotionally drained. What she wanted, according to her journal, was freedom. What she found instead was the Amazon. Madeline's decision had seemed impulsive, even reckless. She had no family in South America, no academic research project, no travel sponsorship. Yet she arrived in Manaus in early May and began moving further downriver by boat, staying in hostels, logging her journey on Instagram with a careful mix of poetic captions and tired smiles. But beneath the curated posts, those closest to her noticed something odd. She had begun speaking cryptically in her private messages, telling one friend, "It feels like the forest is calling me, like there's something here I'm supposed to find." 3 weeks later, she and Lily vanished. The alarm was raised by the manager of a remote guest house near Teff. Madeline had checked in, paid in cash, and promised to return after a short trip with a guide she had met in town. But she never came back. Brazilian authorities, pressured by both American diplomats and international headlines, launched an exhaustive search. Helicopters scanned the canopy. Boats scoured the rivers. Soldiers combed through the jungle with dogs and machetes. They found nothing, no camp, no stroller, no discarded supplies. Just silence. The official explanation, grim but convenient, was that Madeline and Lily had been taken by the forest. Whether by caiman, jaguar, or python, the Amazon devoured people with frightening regularity. The report filed her under lost, presumed deceased. For the public, the story hardened into a single chilling image: a young mother and her baby swallowed whole by the green abyss. But that was not the end. 1 year later, in June 2023, a team of indigenous hunters moving through the flooded jungle near Kauai encountered something that made their blood run cold. It was a green anaconda, one of the largest on record, sluggish and grotesque. Its body stretched into a swollen, unnatural bulge nearly as wide as an oil drum. The men stared, whispering. It was not the size of a deer, nor the familiar contour of a capybara. This bulge was wrong, angular, human. They killed the snake with spears and machetes. And when its body was cut open, the rainforest seemed to fall into an even deeper silence. Inside was a shape wrapped in decayed fabric, a woman's torso, and, wedged against her, the faint outline of a much smaller body. The jungle had given back its secret, or so it seemed, because what emerged from the python's belly was only the beginning of the real horror. The carcass of the anaconda lay stretched across the muddy bank, like a grotesque monument. Steam rose in thin wisps under the afternoon heat, and the metallic smell of blood mingled with the sickly stench of rot. The hunters, men who had killed hundreds of animals in their lives, did not speak. They only stared. The bulge had split open after the final cut, spilling half-digested swamp reeds, bile, and something else: fabric, pale flesh, and the unmistakable remains of a human ribcage. But this was no ordinary discovery. When the hunters spread the remnants out on palm leaves, they realized the clothing was American torn denim, a faded cotton shirt patterned with daisies. And tucked against the torso, in a cocoon of decomposed fabric, was a smaller skeleton no bigger than a child's car seat. One of the men crossed himself. Another backed away, muttering that the spirits had cursed him. It took less than 24 hours for news to spread from their village to Kauai, and from Kauai to Manaus, where the regional police were contacted. Within days, a small convoy of officials arrived at the riverbank with gloves, evidence bags, and cameras for a case that had been declared dead a year earlier. The recovery of 2 bodies inside a snake was a nightmare that reawakened every headline. The official return. The remains were flown to Manaus under heavy guard. Forensics confirmed what everyone already suspected. The DNA matched Madeline Carter and her infant daughter, Lily. At least, that was the story in the press. Smiling officials announced that the mystery of the missing American tourist had been solved. It was tragic, they admitted, but also natural. The Amazon was an unforgiving place. A massive anaconda, one of the largest recorded, had simply struck when mother and child wandered too close to the riverbank. But privately, the scientists handling the remains were unsettled. Madeline's bones showed fractures inconsistent with constriction alone. Several ribs had splintered in ways that looked like blunt trauma, not crushing coils. Her skull had a crack above the left temple, a blow, sharp and deliberate. And Lily's tiny wrist bones carried marks that resembled ligature bruises. One pathologist whispered to another, "This isn't a snake attack. They were dead before they ever touched the water." The American angle. Back in Portland, the Carter family had been living in limbo for a year. Madeline's mother, a retired nurse, had begged consulates and journalists for answers. Her ex-husband, the father of Lily, had given detached television interviews, alternating between grief and defensiveness. When the official confirmation reached them, Madeline and Lily found dead in the belly of a python, the family released a statement that sounded more resigned and sorrowful. They thanked Brazilian authorities. They asked for privacy. But behind closed doors, Madeline's sister, Claire, didn't buy it. "I know she was reckless, but she wasn't stupid," Claire later told reporters. "She didn't just walk into a swamp and hand herself to a snake. Something else happened out there. Something we're not being told." Her instincts weren't wrong. The forest speaks. As the press devoured the python's story, another quieter voice began to emerge. Local villagers who claimed they had seen Madeline long after she supposedly vanished. One fisherman swore he ferried a white woman with a baby upriver weeks after the disappearance date. A guide in Teff insisted he'd seen her boarding a canoe with two men he didn't recognize. And a shopkeeper remembered selling powdered milk to a pale, tired woman who tried to communicate in broken Portuguese. At first, these accounts were dismissed as confused or opportunistic. But when investigators retraced Madeline's final known movements, inconsistencies piled up. The guide she was supposedly traveling with had no record. The guest house owner who last saw her couldn't describe the boat she left on. And her Instagram account, dormant for weeks before she vanished, suddenly showed signs of login activity after she was presumed missing. Someone had used her phone. Someone had deleted messages. The snake that lied. Perhaps the most chilling detail came from the indigenous hunters themselves. When questioned by police, they admitted the snake had been caught not wandering freely, but chained to a tree with heavy iron links. The creature had been trapped, penned like livestock. Its body bore cuts and scars suggesting it had been forced to feed unnaturally. And the bulge? They weren't even sure the snake had eaten it alive. One hunter whispered to an officer, "It looked like someone pushed the bodies inside." But when pressed to repeat this claim on the record, he refused. Fear flickered in his eyes. The first shadow. By the time these whispers reached the Carter family in the United States, the official narrative was already locked. Tragic accident by python. No further questions. No deeper autopsies. But in Brazil, detectives quietly began to suspect they were looking at something very different. The anaconda wasn't the predator. It was the cover-up. And the real predator, the one who had stalked Madeline Carter and her child to the jungle, was still out there, walking on two legs. The jungle kept its secrets, but it also left stains. In the weeks following the grisly discovery, investigators retraced the fragments of Madeline's journey through the Amazon. What emerged was less a tale of naive tourists swallowed by chance, and more a shadow play of manipulation, isolation, and perhaps even a trap set long before she vanished. Her Instagram account, the lifeline that once broadcast photos of riverside sunsets and Lily's gummy smiles, had abruptly cut off on May 23rd, 3 weeks after she arrived. The last photo was eerie in retrospect. Madeline sitting in a wooden canoe, her baby balanced in her lap, the river stretching behind her like a liquid wall of darkness. The caption read only, following the call. Friends back home thought it was metaphorical. Investigators now read it as literal. Following whose call? The guest house near Teff where Madeline had last checked and provided a handwritten register. Her name was there, dated May 19th. She had scrawled with guide in the notes column, but when detectives asked for a name, the innkeeper's memory faltered. He was local, the man muttered, maybe from further upriver. I didn't know him. Pressed harder, he contradicted himself. At first the guide was young, then older, then wearing a hat, then not. His story twisted like vines, each version less convincing than the last. Finally, he refused to answer more questions. And that wasn't the only gap. The register pages for the week of Madeline's stay vanished from police custody days later. Some clerk had misfiled them, or someone had made sure they would never be read again. From village to village, fragments surfaced. A fisherman named Joao described ferrying a tired woman with a baby across a flooded channel late at night. He remembered because she cried quietly the entire ride, whispering to her child in English. She wasn't alone. 2 men accompanied her, one carrying a bag that clinked like tools. Another account came from a small shop. The owner swore that a pale woman purchased baby formula and left quickly, head down. But when shown Madeline's photo, he hesitated. It looks like her, he admitted, but different, like she was drugged, or afraid to speak. These sightings stretched well beyond the date. She was declared missing. If true, Madeline had survived days, maybe weeks, after the world already believed her gone. Among Madeline's belongings, recovered belatedly from storage in Manaus, was a leather-bound notebook. Most pages were filled with messy sketches, trees, snakes, boats. But near the back, the writing turned frantic. I think he's following me. He says the forest chooses who stays and who goes. Lily won't stop crying. I'm scared it will anger him. The final page ended mid-sentence, the ink smeared by water or sweat. If someone finds this, tell Claire I. The word stopped, the line trailing downward. Pathologists revisiting the remains found in the anaconda reported details that the first examination had downplayed. Madeline's skull fracture was sharp, not rounded, more consistent with machete but than a fall. Her ribs showed staggered breaks at intervals, as though struck repeatedly. And then there was Lily. The baby's bones were small, delicate, but unmistakable in what they revealed. The faint grooves of restraint around her ankles. This was not a case of a snake striking in the wild. This was abduction violence, and a cover-up staged with the cooperation of nature's most feared predator. Locals began speaking quietly of a man known as Okakador, the hunter, an outsider who drifted through villages offering to guide tourists, always for cash, never for receipts. Some said he had once worked for illegal loggers, others that he had been a poacher. Descriptions varied but carried a common thread: tall, scarred, and always watching. One man claimed Okakador believed the forest demanded sacrifices, that feeding bodies to snakes and rivers was an offering that kept the land generous. At first, investigators dismissed it as folklore, the way people in the jungle invented monsters to explain real crimes. But when they overlaid the map of disappearances in the region, foreign travelers, researchers, even locals who wandered too far, there was a pattern. Dozens had gone missing along a corridor stretching from Tef to Kowari. The python that regurgitated Madeline's secret might not have been the first to carry such a load. The question that haunted detectives wasn't just who killed Madeline and Lily, but why the remains were placed in that snake at all. If it was ritual, it was barbaric. If it was concealment, it was theatrical. But then one chilling possibility emerged. Someone wanted the bodies to be found. The hunters who discovered the anaconda said the chains holding it were old, rusted, yet the trap itself had been baited recently. The bulge inside the python was so unnaturally preserved it seemed staged, as if someone had stuffed the corpses only days before. Madeline and Lily had been missing for over a year. Were they really inside the snake all that time, or had they been kept somewhere else, alive or dead, before being offered up as a finale to a story no one asked to see? The Amazon had swallowed them once. Now it seemed to have spit them back out. But the forest was not the author of this tale. Someone else was pulling the strings, hiding in the green, watching the world choke on the horror he had left behind. And the deeper investigators pushed into the case, the more it became clear. The anaconda was not the monster. It was the message. The file on disappearances in the Amazon was thick, but until Madeline's case, no one had tried to read it as a single story. Each loss had been explained away by the jungle's vastness, the river's hunger, the cruelty of predators. Yet, when the names were placed side by side, and the dots connected along the black arteries of the Amazon, and its tributaries, a different picture appeared. The trail of vanished travelers traced the movement of one shadow, and that shadow, Locals whispered belonged to Cacador. The man's real name was unknown, but scraps of rumor formed an outline. He was said to be a mixed heritage, Brazilian and European, fluent in English but with an accent that shifted depending on who he spoke to. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face scarred from some long-ago accident or fight. The scar itself became a signature, cut deep across his jaw, pulling the skin into a permanent sneer. He offered his services to foreigners with curiosity but little caution, promising shortcuts to waterfalls, sacred groves, or hidden lagoons. He appeared in towns when boats of tourists arrived, then slipped back into the forest for weeks at a time. Each time he vanished, someone else did too. Detectives working with both Brazilian federal police and American consular agents began to see his methods as ritual rather than random. Witnesses described how he spoke of the forest as a god, one that demanded gifts. To wander here, he said, was to walk into a mouth that never stopped feeding. He told stories of snakes that swallowed sins, of rivers that erased names. In the notebook Madeline left behind, one fragment now sounded less like paranoia and more like a transcription. He says the green eats everything, but it only keeps what it wants. The rest it returns. Authorities sent plainclothes officers upriver, posing as researchers. In remote villages, they asked questions quietly, buying drinks, listening. Stories emerged of tourists who had left with Cacador and never returned. A Canadian backpacker in 2019. A French couple in 2020. A Brazilian student who went missing after asking too many questions about logging camps. Each tale ended the same way. Silence, then the river closing over another name. What gave investigators pause was the ritualistic element. Bodies, when found, had always been arranged, wedged in hollow logs, submerged with stones, or in rare cases, inside predators. What looked like nature's randomness bore the pattern of man who wanted his killings mistaken for accidents of the wild. The python was the loudest message yet. The cuts on its scales, the chains around its body. This was not concealment, it was theater. Cacador had staged a discovery, baiting the world with horror. But why expose himself after years of silence? One theory suggested arrogance. Another, desperation. Perhaps he feared losing control of his legend. Perhaps the bodies of Madeline and Lily were his masterpiece, a display meant to confirm his myth. Yet a darker possibility emerged. Someone else was helping him. The missing guest house records, the vanishing testimony, the quick closure of the case, all pointed to more than one hand protecting the hunter's work. Interpol analysts combed through passport records, trying to match sightings of a tall, scarred man to any known criminal. Nothing. He was a ghost, moving without paper trails, known only by whispers. But then came a break. In a riverside bar near Kauai, an undercover officer spotted a carving on the wooden counter, gouged deep with a knife, a serpent coiled around a skull. Locals said the symbol was a hunter's mark, left behind where he drank. Beneath it, scratched faintly, were initials, MC, Madeline Carter. It was not a coincidence. It was possession. Investigators now had to face the unthinkable. That Madeline's death had not been the unfortunate consequence of stumbling into the jungle's teeth, but a deliberate act by a man who collected lives as offerings. The snake had not chosen her. Cacador had. But every time police closed in, the forest itself shielded him. Villages denied knowledge. Witnesses recanted. Hunters who once spoke of his presence fell silent, claiming they had misremembered. One officer remarked bitterly, "It's like the trees themselves are covering for him." Then came the discovery that changed the investigation from pursuit to nightmare. Hidden in a shack deep in the forest, abandoned but not empty, searchers found cages. Not for animals. For people. Inside lay scraps of fabric, children's toys, and a rosary broken in half. On the walls, smeared in ash and blood, were crude drawings of serpents swallowing stick figures. Each figure was marked with a date. The final one was circled, May 2022, the date Madeline disappeared. And yet the most chilling detail was not the drawings, but what lay beneath them, a wooden box, sealed tight, filled with small bones. Too many to belong to a single victim. The hunter was not a phantom. He was flesh and blood, but his trail was older, darker, and far more crowded with ghosts than anyone had imagined. And somewhere still alive, still moving, he was watching the searchers find his shrine. The forest was no longer a wilderness. It was his cathedral. And Madeline Carter was only one of the sacrifices laid upon its altar. The shack had been a mausoleum. Its walls whispered the lives extinguished within them. But when investigators carried the evidence back to Manaus, they discovered something stranger than bones. The dates painted in ash and blood matched disappearances reported not only in Brazil, but across South America, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela. Travelers who had vanished without explanation now shared a single author. Ocacador's reach was not the work of one man moving alone. It was a network. Word of the shack spread quickly, but those who had first spoken to police began to retreat into silence. One fisherman who had described ferrying a pale woman with a baby was found drowned, his body snagged in reeds upriver. Officially, it was ruled an accident. Unofficially, the officers who recovered him saw the blunt force mark behind his ear. Others vanished in quieter ways. A shopkeeper who remembered Madeline buying formula closed the store overnight and disappeared into the interior. A woman who once claimed to have seen Ocacador walking through her village retracted her statement, saying she had confused him with someone else. It was not fear of the jungle that silenced them. It was fear of something else, the circle that protected the hunter. In the port towns along the Amazon, where logging companies and smugglers blurred with legitimate trade, investigators began hearing a phrase whispered in taverns, a Mercadoria Viva, the living merchandise. Tourists, researchers, even children from remote villages. Some were taken not for sacrifice, but for sale. Human trafficking routes ran parallel to logging paths, with men like Ocacador serving as suppliers. The bodies staged in snakes or rivers were not only ritual, they were warnings, a currency of fear. Madeline's case, with its grotesque spectacle, might have been more than ritual, it might have been punishment. Had she stumbled into a trade she was never meant to see? Back in Oregon, Madeline's sister, Claire, was digging into her siblings' digital trail. She noticed strange gaps, email drafts saved at odd hours, text messages that vanished from backups. One discovery chilled her, a folder on Madeline's cloud account, hidden and mislabeled, containing scanned receipts from small villages in Brazil. One receipt bore the name of a supply shack near the river. Another listed purchases of antibiotics and baby formula. But the handwriting at the bottom, scribbled like a signature, was not Madeline's. It was jagged, male, unfamiliar. Who was using her accounts? And why had the logins continued for weeks after her disappearance? Claire turned the files over to investigators, who cross-checked them with sightings. The times lined up. Madeline, or someone moving in her name, had traveled further than anyone believed. Then came the recording. An anthropologist working with indigenous communities handed police a cassette tape he claimed had been given to him years earlier by a frightened villager. The tape was old, grain crackling, but the voice was clear. A man speaking in Portuguese, low and steady, intoning like a sermon. The forest is the mouth of God. We feed at the lost so that we are not lost. Every offering keeps the river calm. Every body swallowed keeps the land alive. Without sacrifice, there is no survival. In the background, faintly, a baby cried. Then silence. The anthropologist swore the tape was dated from 2018, long before Madeline ever set foot in Brazil. The problem was not evidence. The problem was obstruction. Each time police tried to escalate, files were delayed, witnesses reassigned, orders stalled. Even within their own ranks, someone was tying knots in the investigation. One detective muttered, "We are not hunting him. We are protecting him." The implication was as terrifying as the crimes themselves. Ocacador wasn't just a ghost in the trees. He was a tool, someone powerful enough to be shielded, yet expendable enough to be blamed. A man who could move silently between ritual sacrifice and organized trafficking, because both served the same masters. The bodies inside the anaconda now looked less like a concealment and more like a signal. The hunter wanted them found. He wanted the world to look. But to look at what? His power? His defiance? Or was it his way of showing he had grown too large to be ignored, too valuable to be silenced by those who once protected him? The bulge inside the python was more than a grotesque grave. It was a message. I am still here. I am untouchable. And behind the scarred face of Ocacador, investigators began to glimpse the outline of something worse. A machinery of men who thrived in silence, in missing persons, in bones buried beneath vines. Madeline Carter and her daughter were not swallowed by chance. They were swallowed by design. And somewhere in the endless green, the hunter waited for the next offering. The deeper investigators pressed, the more it became clear that the hunter's crimes weren't scattered accidents of wilderness, but entries in a ledger written in blood. Each disappearance carried markers that, once decoded, painted a pattern of deliberate ritual. The jungle wasn't simply his hunting ground. It was his theater, and the world was his audience. In an archive buried within the police department in Manaus, a clerk uncovered a set of reports from the mid-1990s. They described a string of disappearances near Tabatinga, along the Colombian border. Foreigners mostly, bird watchers, missionaries, a German aid worker. In each case, what little was recovered told a haunting story. A torn boot laced with vines. A camera submerged in mud, its film water-rotted except for a single frame of blurred leaves. A necklace wedged in the roots of a tree. At the time, investigators chalked them up to the hazards of the forest. But in the margins of one report, a young officer had scribbled something in pencil. Look for the scar. The officer was long dead, but his note became a thread. Witness sketches spanning decades, all showing a tall man. A cut across his jaw, his features obscured by shadow but repeating like an echo. The hunter had been here longer than anyone realized. The discovery of the shack and the python had briefly forced the world's eyes onto the Amazon, but when headlines cooled, the pressure to pursue the case faltered. The tourism industry wanted quiet. Local politicians wanted denial. And above them all, someone unseen seemed to want a hunter alive and working. But there were those who refused to let the silence win. Claire Carter, back in Oregon, received an anonymous package left on her porch in the dead of night. Inside was a flash drive. No note, no sender. The files it contained were raw footage, shaky handheld recordings taken deep in the jungle. In one clip, torches flickered as figures stood in a circle, their faces hidden by hoods stitched with crude serpent patterns. In the center, a wooden post jutted from the soil. Bound to it was a figure, a woman, her head slumped, her body trembling. The video cut off before anything happened. Claire nearly destroyed the drive in terror, but instead she turned it over to federal agents. The footage, they confirmed, had metadata that placed in the Brazilian interior just months before Madeline disappeared. The hunter was not alone. He was part of something larger. Agents began to suspect the rituals weren't only about belief or theater. They might have been a kind of initiation, a proof of loyalty demanded by a cult woven into the trafficking network. Victims weren't only swallowed by snakes for misdirection. They were marked, staged, cataloged. Each killing served two masters, the superstition of the cult and the profit of the trade. Among the flash drive's files was a single photograph of a weathered leather book. On its cover, embossed with cracked gold leaf, was an image of a serpent swallowing a human figure. The book's pages were visible only in glimpses, but one detail leapt out, names written in jagged script. Some had dates beside them. Others were crossed out. The blood ledger. When word of this ledger reached investigators, their fears crystallized. The shack with its bone box had been only a fragment. The true record was hidden elsewhere, carried or guarded by the hunter himself. The ledger was proof of trafficking, of murder, of the network that kept him shielded. Whoever held it would control not only the hunter, but the men who profited from him. And yet chasing it meant chasing shadows. Informants spoke of meetings in the jungle where figures in hoods carried bundles wrapped in snakeskins. A logger described stumbling upon a clearing marked with serpent carvings, where he was worn away under threat of death. Rumors spread that the ledger was written not only in ink, but in blood, that the hunter cut his victims before writing, soaking their names into the page. For Claire, the horror deepened when she noticed a detail in the blurred video footage. The woman tied to the post wore a bracelet of woven threads, red and blue, knotted in a pattern. It was identical to the one she herself had given Madeline before her trip. Her knees buckled when she realized what it meant. The video wasn't from months before Madeline's disappearance. It was from the night she vanished. The revelation fractured the investigation. Some agents argued the bracelet was coincidence, a common trinket. Others whispered that the video had been leaked intentionally, that someone inside the network wanted the family to know. But not the world. But one truth stood clear. Madeline and her daughter had not wandered into the forest and been lost to chance. They had been chosen, marked, prepared for ritual, and the hunter's ledger still held their names. Somewhere in the endless green, in a book stained with blood and jungle rot, the final chapter of their story had already been written. The forest had always been the hunter's camouflage, but now it became clear that the jungle was more than cover, it was sanctuary. Every trail investigators followed led to dead ends. Every informant who spoke too loudly ended up silent. Yet the closer they came, the more the myth of Okakador twisted into something sharper. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a symbol that frightened even those who had built him. An undercover agent embedded in Kawari claimed he'd seen the hunter in the flesh. Scar-jaw tall, cloaked in mud-stained canvas. He didn't move like a hermit. He moved like a man accustomed to command, trailed by others who carried machetes with the obedience of soldiers. They called him Betrayal das Sombras, the Master Shadows. When the agent tried to track them deeper, he was intercepted not by thugs, but by local police. They held him at gunpoint, confiscated his gear, and released him only after erasing his recordings. The message was unmistakable. The hunter lived beneath a veil stitched from both criminals and lawmen. In the capital, a whistleblower stepped forward. A low-ranking clerk, face pale and trembling, confessed that certain reports of missing foreigners were never filed into the national system. They were rerouted, buried, or marked as resolved. When pressed, he admitted the orders came from higher up, from officials who claimed they were protecting economic interests. The phrase rang hollow, but its meaning was clear enough. If tourists fear the Amazon, industries tied to it, logging, oil, even ecotourism would bleed. Better to sacrifice the missing than stain the profits. In this way, Okakador was no rogue predator. He was tolerated, shielded, a ghost allowed to roam so that the machinery of men could continue to turn. Claire Carter, watching from Oregon, felt the investigation slipping like water through her hands. Each new lead was heavier than the last, crushing her with revelations but never offering resolution. Still, she refused to let her sister's story dissolve into myth. She leaked the bracelet photo and portions of the video to journalists. The footage sparked international outrage, headlines screaming of cults in the Amazon, of ritual sacrifice shielded by corruption. But with exposure came retaliation. Claire began receiving calls from unknown numbers, static-heavy voices warning her to stop. One night, her apartment door was scratched with the crude outline of a snake. She stopped sleeping. She stopped leaving her house. The hunter's reach had crossed oceans. Back in Brazil, investigators stumbled on a clearing deep within the forest. Charred posts stood in a circle, surrounded by feathers, bones, and melted wax from candles. At the center lay the carcass of a caiman, its belly sliced open, its insides replaced with a bound human skeleton. The bones had been painted with red dye in swirling patterns of snakes. It was both theater and threat. A stage left behind to remind them that the jungle belonged to him. Among the ashes was a shard of leather, brittle but intact. Embossed faintly into it was the edge of a serpent swallowing a man. The ledger's cover. The proof they had been chasing. But the pages were gone. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A drone sweeping above the canopy for logging surveillance caught a glimpse of a figure moving along a riverbank. The resolution was grainy, the distance vast, but the scarred face was undeniable. He was carrying a satchel, a bulky, rectangular shape pressed against its side. It was the ledger. The footage sent a shiver through every officer who viewed it. Okakador was real. He was alive. And he carried with him the book of blood that could tear open everything. Every disappearance, every name, every cover-up. But the footage ended with him vanishing into the green, swallowed as though the force itself conspired to protect him. Then the twist. For weeks, authorities in Brazil had maintained that the python's bulge had revealed nothing more than the grim remains of Madeline and her child. But a forensic pathologist in Sao Paulo quietly reached out to Claire with a different story. The skeletal remains did belong to a woman and a child, but the DNA of the woman did not match Madeline Carter. Claire's world tilted. If the body inside the snake wasn't Madeline, then who was she? Another victim? Another entry in the ledger? And if Madeline wasn't in the python, where was she? The serpent's veil had lifted, but instead of answers, it revealed a darker truth. The hunter had staged a discovery. The python wasn't the end of the story. It was bait. And now, everyone was following his trail, right where he wanted them. The revelation that the python's remains were not Madeline's detonated like dynamite. For a year, the world had accepted the grotesque spectacle as a final chapter, a mother and child swallowed by the merciless jungle. But the truth was stranger, more chilling. The hunter had engineered it. He hadn't just killed. He had written the story himself. Investigators pieced together what they could. The woman inside the snake had been another foreigner, a backpacker from Argentina, who vanished 6 months before Madeline. Her family had never been notified. Her disappearance absorbed into the long list of Amazon vanishings buried under bureaucracy. Somehow, the hunter had preserved her remains, hidden them until the time came to stage his masterpiece. The swollen python was theater, a macabre stage designed to distract, to give the world closure that was never true. And while cameras focused on the serpent's belly, Madeline's real trail was growing colder. Claire refused to accept defeat. She turned over every file, every photograph, until her eyes burned. In one of Madeline's final social media posts, she noticed something odd, a reflection in the window of her guest house. Behind Madeline, blurred by glass and distance, was a man with a scar along his jaw. The hunter had been watching her long before the day she vanished. The implication was terrifying. She hadn't simply wandered into his path. She had been chosen. In the jungle, agents discovered another clearing. This one was newer, its fires still smoldering. At the center stood a wooden effigy of a serpent coiled around a woman. Stuffed into its mouth was a torn scrap of cloth, baby pink, faded and frayed. The DNA confirmed it. The fabric belonged to Lily's blanket. It was proof of nothing, yet proof of everything. A sign that the hunter was alive, still playing his game, still taunting those who pursued him. Each discovery was an accident. It was breadcrumb. He wanted them close, but not too close. He wanted the chase. The legend of Okakador grew, whispered by locals like a prayer and a curse. Some said he was a servant of the forest, chosen to keep balance through sacrifice. Others swore he was no man at all, but a spirit who borrowed faces and scarred them into permanence. But investigators knew the truth was darker. He was a man made powerful not by myth, but by protection. A puppet and a master both, walking between cult and cartel. The ledger remained unseen, the name still hidden. But with every breadcrumb, the hunter was shaping his own myth, daring the world to look at him not as fugitive, but as legend. And then came the final twist. A new package arrived on Claire's doorstep, just as a flash drive had months earlier. Inside was a single photograph, printed on aged, curling paper. It showed a woman standing barefoot in the jungle, hair matted, face gaunt. In her arms was a child, older now, her eyes hollow but alive. Scrawled on the back in Portuguese were 3 words, Ela ainda respira. She still breathes. Claire dropped the photo, as if it burned her fingers. If it was real, Madeline and Lily were alive. But alive for what? Captives? Offerings? Tools in the hunter's game? The jungle had not consumed them. The hunter had claimed them. The case was never officially closed because closure was impossible. For every report filed, there was another redacted. For every discovery, 100 questions. But among those who whisper about Okakador, a new refrain emerged. The hunter does not hunt to feed himself. He hunts to remind us that he can. And somewhere in the green abyss, beneath the endless canopy, a scarred man with a ledger of names carried on his work. Madeline Carter's story was not an ending at all. It was a beginning, because the hunter was still out there, and he was waiting. Of course, the Amazon keeps its secrets, but together we uncover them one story at a time. If you want more chilling mysteries, disappearances, and stories that linger long after the screen goes dark, make sure to subscribe so you never miss what lies beneath the surface.